Good evening, I'm Mike Knetter, and welcome to the UW Now live stream, where we bring you experts from the Badger community addressing timely and important topics. The devastating wildfires in Southern California have really stunned the world, taking lives, ravaging property, and raising a host of questions about the future of the region. Our hearts are with all of those struggling with the fallout from this tragedy. We have over 6,000 alumni living in the LA metro area, in addition to many current students and their families. Our gratitude also goes out to the first responders and the many people who are aiding in the efforts to contain the fires and support people who've been impacted. In fact, a quick shout out to our own Badger men's basketball team. They're on their West Coast swing, and they volunteered yesterday at the West Side Food Bank in Santa Monica, California. While these fires are not yet fully contained, they have already caused unprecedented harm to the region. Tonight, we have invited 3 guests to give us some perspectives on the current situation and how we might adapt in the future. What is the evidence on the frequency and severity of wildfires over time? What factors contribute to wildfire risk? And how can we mitigate the impact of wildfires? And what are the impacts on the insurance market and the insurance industry? And what changes do insurers hope to see in the future? We're joined by 3 guests who can shed some light on those issues tonight. Jonathan Patz holds the John P. Holton Chair of Health and the Environment. He also served as the inaugural chair of the Global Health Institute at the University of Wisconsin. For 15 years, he served as the lead author for the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That organization shared the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. Ben Wright is a UW alum and the Chief Underwriting Officer at American Family Insurance. He leads product development, product management, actuarial, and data science and analytics for AmFam's property and casualty business. So he'll have a lot to say about that aspect of our problem. And leading us off tonight will be Paul Zedler. He's a professor emeritus of environmental studies and former associate dean for research and education in the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies. He has researched fire and fire effects in Southern California and other regions for much of his career. He's a 2-time Badger, and he joined the faculty at UW in 1988. So thank you all for joining us on a Tuesday evening. This is a very weighty topic, and of course, again, our hearts go out to all those who've been impacted directly by these fires and have friends and family impacted. So as promised, we'll start tonight with Paul, who's going to give us an overview of wildfires and wildfire risk and what he's learned in studying them throughout his career. Thank you, Paul.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike. I agree. What's going on in California puts kind of a somber background to what I'm going to say. So with that said, and wishes going out that situation will wrap itself up soon, I start by pointing out the wildfire dilemma from the standpoint of the conservation of biodiversity, because that is my concern, and my professional concern is seeing that we preserve what we have of nature. And I've picked out a quote from a book by Finney and other authors on fire behavior. And it starts out saying, wildland fire is traditionally the domain of land management. Professional foresters and other stewards of our wildlands are concerned with balancing the ecological requirements for fire against protecting from threats by fire to commercial and human lives. So what we're dealing with in the LA situation is extreme, well, more than a threat, a reality of what happens when a wildfire gets into an urban setting. And this is not the first serious urban wildfire. We've had other cases in San Diego County. There was the Cedar Fire, in which there was nothing the magnitude of what's going on in LA, but still a very significant number of houses were burned when the fire jumped from the vegetation into the community. So what is he talking about? Ecologically speaking, if you just take a piece of land and you let it alone, vegetation will eventually fill up the space to the limits of its capacity of the environment to support it. Now, in small parts of the earth that rarely or never experience drought, fire is not a factor to consider unless, of course, fire-using humans are present, which is another theme of what I'm going to say here. Okay, in other parts, including essentially all of the US, fire has been a major factor that has shaped the terrestrial biota of the planet, animals and plants, on both the long evolutionary time scale, which accounts for the traits of the plants that we find in places that burn occasionally and or more frequently, and the shorter ecological time scales when it's more about arranging the pieces than it is about generating new species. And that's at the scale of a few dozen human lifespans. I'm going to now go to an example drawn on my experience in Southern California. This picture was taken on Otay Mountain, which is a mountain that lies directly on the US-Mexico border. Anyway, what we're looking at here is a fire that occurred in 2003, and this picture was taken in 2004. And we see in the foreground individual Tecate cypress trees. Now, Tecate cypress is a conifer. It's a small tree, but it kind of grows like a large bush. Big ones can get up to maybe, 10, 20 centimeter, 10, 20 meters. That's about it. In the background, we see human action that was imposed during the occurrence of this wildfire, which is for a bulldozer to run a fire line to clear the brush out of the way to stop the fire. Okay, now on the next slide, I mentioned that this species is capable of re-establishing itself from closed cones, just like, as I say, the jack pine. So they keep changing the names. I really appreciate the work of our taxonomic colleagues. So now it's Heperocyperus forbesii. It accumulates seeds in cones that remain closed, but they open up when they're heated by a fire. And based on the seed count, which I've made on this species per cone, this one branch holds about 4,500 seeds to reestablish the next generation. And keep in mind, speaking of the demography of plants, for Tecate cypress, only one of these 4,500 seeds has to reach maturity in order for it to have replaced itself. So it's got considerable capacity for doing that. All right, in the next slide, the area in the foreground is, might say, naturally recovering. And you can see that there's a difference in the appearance of the vegetation. In the foreground, this is, I should mention, taken in the dry season. So that brown layer during the winter, when there were rain, that would have been all green, dense green cover. In the foreground, we see natural regeneration with the Tecate cypresses seeding in, and if I had more slides, I could show you the little seedlings coming up. In the background, this area has been disturbed by the bulldozer, and what we see there are exotic non-native species, not the native species regenerating. So here it's just an example of how well-intentioned management of fires can cause damage to the biodiversity resource. And in the next slide, this apparently was taken during the growing season because now you can see it green and growing. And I mentioned some of those species. I mean, I give you the Latin names, but they're all weedy annual things that were brought here by the first settlers and have established throughout California. So what can we do to reduce human life, property, and damage and all that stuff? One way is to stop them before they start. And that has traditionally been received a lot of emphasis. So how do we do that? Well, we develop the technology and deploy the resources to detect ignitions. That's what we're talking about, a fire start, and pounce on them before they can spread. Problem number one, technology isn't quite there yet, and until that happy day when it is faultless, we could still require backup suppression capacity beyond the pounce because this will not be 100% effective always. So there will always be the possibility that even when we arrive at an ignition very promptly, it may yet escape control. Because well, I should throw this in as an aside, but it's very, very important. Under the right conditions, which is what's going on in Los Angeles, with high winds and fuels ready to burn, fires can spread so fast that even with a fairly large number of people available, they can't keep up with it. The second problem, of course, it would be very expensive. And the third problem, in some places and under certain conditions, there can be multiple ignitions as has been observed in lightning storms. So that's where this capacity capability comes into it, because you can have 3 or 4 ignitions within let's say a square mile, and to get them all, of course, would strain the resources. This tells us what we control and what we can't. This is called the fire behavior triangle, and some of you may be familiar with the fire triangle, which is oxygen, heat, and fuel. Well, this one is weather, topography, and fuel. And we've seen in the LA fire topography operating, where a fire will run down a hill or up a hill. This is the one that's extremely dangerous because the fire lays down and so on. What we can manipulate is the fuel. And so a lot of attention and management action is directed to that specific goal, because theoretically, actually, if there's no fuel, there'll be no fire. So the idea is reduce the amount of fuel that can support the fire. And as I said, no fuel, no fire. Now, how do you do that? One way is sort of the mechanical approach. You can mow and cut to reduce the fuel. And so the amount of stuff that can burn, if an ignition should occur, will be less, which increases the possibility that they can stop the fire if there is fuel that allow them to get into the area and control it. Another approach is the controlled or prescribed fire to reduce fuel loading. And the word prescribed is not used lightly, because when the federal and state agencies, people go out to do a prescribed burn, they are literally following a prescription, a very detailed list that they follow, conditions under which they will ignite the fire and conditions under which they will cancel the ignition and all that kind of thing. So it's not done casually. It's very highly controlled if it's done by a well-trained public or private agency. And I should mention here, there is also a private burning done, and this is very common in Wisconsin, so it's not just government agencies involved in this. There would be fewer issues about this if there weren't concerns about maintaining natural biodiversity. So we could hypothetically say, if we had a mile of dense natural vegetation, we could get rid of that and replace it by an irrigated lawn. Well, that would be very effective in preventing wildfires from sneaking up on a housing development. And I should mention one concept which didn't work it into this talk, but it's an important one. It's the WUI, W-U-I, the Wildland Urban Interface. So that's what we're talking about. So if we had this 1 mile of irrigated lawn, the WUI would be, protecting a bunch of houses on the other side. Unless we have fire winds that are 100 miles an hour, as some of them were. Now that's the maximum. So, but still, 50-mile-an-hour winds, 60-mile-an-hour winds. I think that much has been made, and it's important to make this point. What spreads those fires so quickly under those circumstances is you are not only advancing the actual flaming front more rapidly, you're spreading billions of flaming embers, or smoldering embers is more accurate, ahead of the fire, falling down, landing on people's roofs and igniting fires. All right, but it is used, this idea of clearing to reduce the density of fuels is used in the judicious ways, where you can keep the native biodiversity while also reducing the fuel loading. Okay, so it does work under some circumstances, but it can't be a complete solution because of the effect I just mentioned. Okay, now we get to prescribed burns. I should mention in Wisconsin, I mentioned places that have more or less fire. Wisconsin is not a state in which we have a lot of wildfires. We did have the Peshtigo fire, some of you may have heard of that, in the 1870s. That was a very large and very damaging fire. But since then, we haven't really had a lot of huge fires. But that doesn't mean fire doesn't figure into the ecology of the state, because we have good evidence that the Native American populations used fire to clear areas, to hunt game, and so on. So the vegetation we inhabited from the indigenous folks who were here when we arrived was a landscape in which fire had played an important role. That means if we want to sustain the kinds of plants and systems that were here when we arrived, we have to consider using fire. Now, okay, so you do one of these prescribed burns because you don't want to just wait for a wildfire to occur. You want to go out and do the burn when you can do it under safer conditions. When you do that, you can never guarantee it's not going to escape, and sometimes that's happened. It's not a huge problem in Wisconsin, but it has happened. Secondly, fires produce smoke, which presents health hazards, and Jonathan, I think, is going to tell us a lot about that. And I can ask him to confirm that what we know about smoke as a health hazard is that there is no zero level or no level where there is any smoke and there's zero risk of that possibly causing health problems for individuals. So prescribed burns, well, giving you an example, if the people who are doing the fires miscalculate and they expect a certain level of atmospheric conditions to carry the smoke to medium altitudes and disperse, if they've miscalculated and it lays down, as the fire people say, so smoke rolls into an adjacent development, this is not only a health hazard, but it's a social problem and causes a lot of complaints. But prescribed fire proponents say, well, which do you want? You want the inevitable wildfire burning under extreme conditions? Now we're talking more about the Western US, where giant wildfires, well, we know they can happen. So is that what we want to wait for? Or do we want to do prescribed burns in a judicious way to lower intensity under conditions when the smoke is dispersed to minimize the health hazard? So which do we want? Fires under Santa Ana winds are nothing new. And in fact, that picture that I showed you of the 2004 fire did take place under Santa Ana conditions, which you can clearly see in this photo. You can see the smoke blowing out over the ocean, which is an indication we have fires coming. In this case, just it's a textbook case. They're coming from the northwest, which is what you would northeast, I should say, which is classic Santa Ana conditions. So we could end here. Have I used my time? I think I have, and then some.
Well, that's fine, Paul. Thank you. And maybe when we come back to the Q&A, you can tell us, whether the frequency of prescribed burns has decreased over time, or did that somehow contribute to the situation we're facing now? But we'll come back to that. Next, I'd like to invite Jonathan Patz onto the program, who's going to discuss some of the impacts wildfires are having on the health of those in the region going forward. So, Jonathan, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much. It's an honor to be here. So the big question is, what about the weather? Is the weather different? Are these fires worse than before? Scientists at the UCLA have asked the question, has climate change been a factor in this massive fire at LA? And they've determined that climate change has contributed at least a quarter to the aridity of the fuels. And these three graphs, it should have shown up one after another, not all together. The one on the left shows that the period from last May until this January was the second driest in the last 150 years. And that same period, up until from May to January, was the third warmest period in the last 150 years. And you can see on this last graph from on the right that the winds were not off the scale, but very, very windy. Next slide. And this is a study from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences showing that climate change has doubled the risk of wildfires. And in fact, human-caused climate change is responsible for over half of the observed increase in the Western US for forest fuel aridity in the last few decades, as well as doubling the size of the forest fire area over this last period. And you can just see the areas burned that have been increased. Ben will talk more about this, but we're seeing much more area burned than we had before. The wildfires that have been occurring, you can see from that Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences study that climate change has made wildfires twice as likely of happening, especially in the western U.S. The event that happened in 2021, if you remember that summer of 2021, unprecedented heat dome in the western U.S. that had fires throughout California and British Columbia. The smoke affected almost every part of the northern United States. Basically, that summer of 2021 it led to fires across the United States. And notice in this paper from Pediatrics that wildfire smoke is 10 times more dangerous to children, especially children 0 to 5 years of age. So wildfire smoke, the fine particulates from that, are extremely hazardous to children. The image behind that is one showing how extensive the smoke was across the United States. This is where that event of 2021 was made twice, the question is, did human-induced climate change have an impact? And according to the World Weather Attribution Initiative, human-induced climate warming made that event 150 times more likely to happen. In other words, virtually impossible without human-induced climate change. And then, of course, 2 years ago, we had the fires in Quebec that came down and affected New York City. New York was the most polluted city in the world back in June of 2023. And according to the World Weather Attribution Initiative, doing the statistical analysis of how unlikely that event was, again, showing climate change doubled the likelihood of that extreme fire in eastern Canada. Next slide. So you can see here how hazardous this exposure is. New York City reached into that hazardous range as far as wildfire smoke. So there have been some major studies now because fires are increasing in frequency and intensity. This study made the cover of Nature, and they looked at human exposure to wildfire smoke over this 20-year period from 2000 to 2019. Approximately 1 million people die prematurely every year from short-term exposures to air pollution, fine particulate matter, much of that from wildfires, but also from urban pollution. And this yellow highlighted study shows there are some direct impacts of wildfire smoke, especially to pregnant women, because of the adverse birth outcomes. So preterm birth, low birth weight associated with wildfire particulate exposure. Low birth weight has tremendous problems as far broad-ranging problems as far as public health. So this is not trivial, and our team now is working with this Australian team, and we're studying these same birth outcome effects in the United States from the Western wildfires. I've worked in public health for a long time, and the tobacco industry knew for over 50 years how damaging tobacco smoke was, but covered up the evidence for as long as they could. Scientists at ExxonMobil knew about the impact of climate change back in the 70s, and they knew about the information, but they promoted misinformation, even paid for it. And it's very similar to the lies spread by the tobacco industry regarding health harms from smoking. Next slide. And you can just see here, the scientists at Exxon, they very accurately predicted exactly what would be happening with climate change and climatic extremes. So it really begs the question, who should be accountable for these major costs? Next slide. So cities, counties, and states are suing to oil companies. People of the state of California versus Big Oil. This was just ruled to move forward and have standing. So it makes me think about when I think about the devastation. This is a lot of money, a lot of property damage and human health damage. Is it time like tobacco, that we should start thinking about accountability. Our team at the University of Wisconsin is looking at this nexus between climate change, climate solutions, and health, and the idea of burning less fossil fuels. Let aside the risk of wildfires. 5.1 million people die prematurely from burning fossil fuels. So there's some great health opportunities if we can, mitigate climate change and start to get to the root of the problem. And if we can go far upstream and maybe reduce the climatic risk, maybe these wildfires won't be so bad. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. We'll pivot and go to hear from Ben on the insurance implications of these fires.
You bet, Mike, and thanks a lot for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And so as Mike mentioned during his intro, one of the sectors most impacted by weather is the insurance industry. And the frequency and severity of natural catastrophic events is something that professionals in the industry have a keen interest in, given the impacts these events have on both our customers and our financial results. And wildfires are certainly one such event. Recent wildfire trends have had a dramatic impact on the insurance industry over the past several years. The frequency and severity of these events continues to rise, leading to a relatively rapid increase in insured losses associated with the peril. This increase, when combined with increased reconstruction cost inflation triggered by the pandemic and a growing population exposed to wildfires, has led to increased insurance prices, stricter underwriting in affected markets, both of which have created pressures on the affordability and availability of insurance in those areas of the country. However, continued advancements in our understanding of wildfires, how to mitigate their effects through improvements in building methods and materials, as well as stronger partnerships between government officials, academics, and insurers, ultimately can help alleviate these pressures. This map's provided by the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency and shows the projected increase in the number of very large fire weeks, or periods where conditions are conducive to very large fires, by mid-century compared to the past 30 years or so. As can be seen here, much of the country is expected to experience more intense and frequent wildfires associated with extremely dry conditions such as drought and amplified heating, and are occurring during periods of higher winds. Climate change will likely continue to increase the danger from wildfires. For much of the western U.S., projections show that an average temperature increase of 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit would increase the median burned area per year by as much as 600% in some types of forests. This isn't just the western parts of the country that are forecasted to be impacted, though. Areas within the Midwest and eastern parts of the country are also expected to have increased risk. This was actually observed in recent years. For example, last year, there were more than 400 fires reported in the Northeast, burning nearly 8,000 acres. As can be seen here, even our own Wisconsin is not immune, where dry conditions that Paul referenced in the dense forests of the northern part of the state can create significant wildfire risk as well. The trend associated with annual acreage burned over the past few decades supports the projections from the CISA on the prior slide. In recent years, we've observed upwards of 10 million acres burned in many years, more than double the observations from the 80s and the 90s. This has resulted in a dramatic increase in the insured losses associated with wildfires over the past decade, which can be seen in the graph on the right-hand side of this slide. We've observed over $55 billion in losses associated with wildfires over the past decade. That figure excludes the events of this month and is nearly 20 times higher than in the 10 years prior. While some of that is due to rapid increase in reconstruction cost inflation that was triggered by supply chain and labor shortages during the pandemic, the increase in severity of these events and a growing population exposed to them have been significant contributing factors. This unpacks this a little bit further, and we can see here's over the past 10 years, there have been 15 wildfire events that produced more than $1 billion of insured losses. This includes the recent Los Angeles fires of this month, which are now estimated to produce upwards of $35 billion in insured losses. That estimate has continued to grow over the past several days, and has now approached an insured loss similar to the two most impactful hurricanes that we've experienced over the past 15 years before adjustments for inflation. You can also see here that that estimate is more than 3 times as high as the fires from 2017 and 2018, which are considered some of the most devastating fires from an insured perspective over the last couple decades. These trends associated with wildfire losses have required a response from the insurance industry to ensure that carriers can continue to be financially resilient and meet the promises that they've made to all of their customers across the country. The California Camp and Tubbs fires in 2017 and 2018, referenced on the prior slide, triggered a significant increase in investments associated with improving catastrophe models associated with wildfires. Companies such as Verisk, Pitney Bowes, CoreLogic, Zesty AI, and others now provide very robust models that allow insurers to better understand the wildfire risk of their book of business within a very discrete geography. These models have informed changes to insurance product design, pricing, and underwriting over the last several years. Insurance products have had to change in the areas most exposed to wildfires. Prices have had to increase to account for the increased risk. And in areas where regulations or other factors prevent the prices from being commensurate with the risk, availability ultimately has been restricted. And in some cases, we've seen carriers leave certain markets. California has experienced the most pressure in this regard. That sort of action is really one of last resort and is ultimately aimed at ensuring that a carrier can continue to meet its financial obligations to its broader customer base. While the availability of insurance is crucial and plays a critical role when it comes to wildfire risk, mitigation of that risk is just as, if not more important. The insurance industry has and continues to fund research associated with building resilience and sustainable homes in wildfire-prone areas, largely through partnerships with nonprofits such as the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, or IBHS. Additionally, many carriers have partnerships with risk mitigation companies such as Wildfire Defense Systems, which offers a service package designed to enhance an insurer's wildfire loss prevention strategy through pre- and post-firefront mitigation tactics on the properties of the carrier's insureds. Finally, when it comes to reinsurance, reinsurance usage has continued to evolve over the past several years, in part due to wildfire risk. Reinsurance is a contract between an insurance company and a reinsurer, where an insurance company transfers or cedes risk to the reinsurer for a price. This helps an insurance company manage risk and capital, protect insurers from large or catastrophic losses, and helps make coverage more affordable and more available. A catastrophe or cat bond can also be leveraged for similar purposes. A cat bond is a high-yield debt instrument that is designed to raise money for companies in the insurance industry in the event of a natural disaster. A cat bond allows the insurer to receive funding from the bond only if specific conditions, such as a wildfire that causes a certain amount of loss, occur. In an event protected by the bond, if an event protected by the bond activates a payout to the insurance company, the obligation to pay interest and repay the principal is either deferred or completely forgiven, and it provides similar benefits, essentially to traditional reinsurance. Tying back to, earlier, I mentioned the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, and that's a nonprofit scientific research and communications organization that's supported by the insurance industry, whose focus is on building safety research that leads to real-world solutions for home and business owners that create more resilient communities. An example of that is their Wildfire Prepared program, which offers 2 levels of wildfire prepared home designation certification levels. The base level requires actions primarily associated with ensuring that there is a non-combustible perimeter around the home, including a 5-foot home buffer, preparing the home's exterior, and maintaining any decks, covered porches, and the yard. The plus level builds upon that by adding an extra layer of protection that's commonly achieved through newer home construction or during exterior renovations, with focus on roofing and siding materials and soffits that are fire resistant. The photos here provide examples. I've seen live demonstrations at IBHS facilities of the difference between homes hardened for wildfires and not. And it's extremely remarkable how much better homes fit to these standards, are resistant to wildfires, and their embers in particular, than those that are not. Just wanted to provide some sources for learning more about insurance and wildfires. There's a handful of links here. The Insurance Information Institute, they were established in 1960 and have been a trusted source with unique data and data-driven insights on insurance for many decades. They have a wealth of information. IBHS, I already spoke about. NOAA, or the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, is a great resource for climate and weather information in general. It's not necessarily insurance specific, but the information that NOAA collects and provides is something that a lot of the top carriers use today when it comes to assessing climate risk. And finally, CAL FIRE, which provides a wealth of information on hardening a home and addressing home vulnerabilities to better withstand a wildfire, and putting some of the IBHS things into practice. That's a little bit about the insurance market.
Great. Thank you, Ben. That was really helpful. And I was there with Ben at IBHS and saw the demonstration. You know, they can turn on the fans and get 100-mile-per-hour winds going, and they experiment with different settings around the home. But it's really, there's a lot of work being done on that. If we could bring people back in, there's a few questions that came up in the chat, and I'll start with a couple of questions directed more at Ben. William Schmitz was kind of wondering, you know, isn't insurance kind of a break-even business? And, you know, what gets in the way of that? And related to that, Hans Kuttner was wondering, why would insurers leave a market as opposed to just pricing more adequately for the risk? And I guess those two are kind of sort of related, I guess, right? So
sure thing. I think to the first question in terms of insurance being a breaking-even enterprise and why maybe is it not, you know, I'd say like insurers ultimately target a pretty small underwriting margin, I would say, on their business, meaning when we look at the ratio of claims that we pay out or losses that we pay out versus the premiums we collect, typically you'll see that target anywhere from 95 to 97%, meaning 3 to 5 percentage points of underwriting profit. That profit it's small, but it's aimed at one, continuing to be able to invest in the business and innovate from a business perspective. And then two, build capital for, you know, the outsized events, so to speak, that can occur in a given year. And when you think about it from a break-even perspective, I would say that is the big thing that causes underwriting losses in a given year, meaning not breaking even and having a loss as opposed to a profit. There's quite a bit of volatility in our results, and a big driver of that is catastrophes. Catastrophes are generally not even from year to year. We see certain years that have a very outsized number of catastrophes, other years that have very few, and then some in between. And so that sort of volatility creates a volatility in results, meaning we have to generate some underwriting profit to be able to continue to withstand those types of events long term. To the question of insurance carriers leaving markets as opposed to pricing them adequately, I'll say there's a couple factors there. One, insurance is a highly regulated business. It's regulated at the state level. And I think that's a good thing. Ultimately, insurance is a part of the fabric of our society, and you want to make sure that there's some regulation there to make sure that there is accessibility to insurance and affordability from an insurance perspective. That being said, sometimes there are regulations that get in the way of matching price to risk. In those instances, if that propels for a long period of time, what happens is carriers have mounting losses. It creates a need for other states and other customers to subsidize that loss. And sometimes that's ultimately unsustainable. And in the case of California, we most certainly saw that occurring with wildfire risk, as was shown, you know, on some of my prior slides, increasing at a very rapid rate. And ultimately capital and premiums simply not keeping up with that risk because of antiquated regulations and processes from a regulatory perspective. I think, you know, the positive thing there is that the state has more and more come to appreciate those challenges. They have been working with carriers to better understand those challenges. And the commissioner of the state recently rolled out, you know, a sustainable insurance strategy, which takes into account and tries to address some of the shortcomings in the market. And there were a couple big shortcomings from an insurance perspective. One, you know, I had mentioned reinsurance. Reinsurance carries cost. And in California, carriers were not allowed to incorporate the cost of reinsurance into their premiums. Number two, catastrophes and wildfire in particular play a significant risk within the state. And we were not allowed to use catastrophe models in setting premiums. And ultimately, those two things led to what we call a lot of adverse selection, meaning customers that had a significant amount of risk, ultimately having a price that was way lower than their risk presented, and vice versa, customers that had managed that risk better having to pay a lot more. And so it skewed the book of business towards riskier customers that weren't paying enough. It created some pretty significant capital constraints. And so you saw some companies really having at one point no choice but to say, hey, I've got to decrease how much business I have in this state to address it. And so the states have finally started to work with us on that. And I think, long term, it's going to create more partnership than just that. I think insurance is an important vessel in terms of dealing with this risk, but certainly not the only one. If you look at these fires in Los Angeles, there are people that have lost generational homes. They've lost, personal property that carries sentimental meaning to them that they're never going to get back, and insurance can't replace. And so insurance is just one part of that equation. And I think, between academics and insurers and regulators working together, we can develop some better outcomes in terms of managing this risk going forward.
That's a really good answer, Ben. And certainly second your remarks, insurance is the last resort, right? Yeah, it's a lumpy business, both the catastrophe events, as you mentioned, and then even the investment returns can be very lumpy. 2022 was a year when there were a lot of catastrophe losses in the industry, and also it was a bad year to be invested, whether it was stocks or bonds. So there was kind of no way out that year. But
yeah, it's a great point, Mike. In terms of in those years, we had kind of three, like a triple whammy. One, you had rapid inflation, which even outside of catastrophes led to a significant increase in losses. You had a rising level of catastrophes, particularly when it came to severe convective storms. And then, on
investments.
On top of that, you had the investment markets which were significantly challenged. And so you saw huge capital decreases within a lot of carriers. And that also resulted in having to pull out of some markets just to make sure that they could be sustainable long-term for their customer base.
Jonathan, we had a few questions come in about wildfire smoke. Is it much worse than other types of smoke, or is it just that it becomes so prevalent when we have wildfires that there's no other events that produce a volume that great? And then should people be masking in a situation like that? Like, would that help with some of these health-related side effects of the smoke?
Yeah, so I'll take the second question first, and that is that absolutely, like if I was there, I would be wearing an N95 mask, but is that feasible to distribute millions of masks and have them worn properly? Sure, I would recommend wearing a mask if you could get one, but to masses of people, getting the right mask and having them worn right is a challenge. There's a lot, as far as the danger of wildfire smoke, that those papers in pediatrics showing that wildfire smoke is more dangerous, that has shocked a lot of people. A lot of things burn in wildfires, including houses and furniture and other things like that. There are other types of hazardous PM, like out of the tailpipe emissions from cars and diesel especially. But Jamie Schauer, who's the expert in differences between air pollution particles, he's an air pollution chemist. He could tell you the differences, but I don't know the answer other than the epidemiology and these papers showing that children are seeing much more harm, young children, much more harm in wildfire smoke exposure compared to other sources. That's something that is concerning.
Could the California wildfire impact been avoided had there been enough prescribed burns? Ben, do you know anything about that? Because insurers must have an interest in whether that's occurring.
Say from insurance perspective, I think that's still being evaluated. I think there has been quite a bit of feedback over the last several years that area in particular had a significant amount of risk. and encouragement to mitigate it. I think a lot of that unfortunately didn't occur.
Would more prescribed burns have perhaps prevented the situation that we've seen with the wildfires in Los Angeles?
From the UCLA scientists that I was showing those first three graphs, yes, all of these land management is important, but it's not one of these either or. Either it's land management or no fire. The study is showing that the extreme weather impacts, that the aridity, having the record-breaking arid period between May of last year and January, they estimated that led to at least 25% of increasing the risk. And then that broader study from the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences showing climate change impact, making the risk twice as likely. These are things that really need to be taken into consideration. Of course, the land management's important, but in the light of more broad sweeping climate impacts, whatever happens in land management, we have to recognize the increased risks from extreme climate conditions.
Ben, do people that use more fire-resistant materials, so some of the preventive measures that we saw at IBHS, would they be rated differently by an insurer? So you would have an interest in adopting those improved technologies and materials?
Yes, that is the case, especially in California. Actually, I think it was last year it went into effect where California actually mandates that insurance carriers provide a certain amount of credit for certain factors that can mitigate wildfire risk from a construction and a building materials perspective. And so I think there's upwards of 20 different factors or credits potentially that can add up to a certain discount. And we're required to factor those into our rates. And a lot of those practices have extended to other states as well. And again, it's to encourage, some responsibility on behalf of the homeowner in terms of mitigating that risk, which is good, not just for the homeowner, it's good for, the broader communities as well, in terms of the more resilience there is, the less economic consequence there is when these events occur.
Great. We had a question from Chuck Weiss that just referenced, we've focused maybe in some of our slides on data comparisons over the last 20 years or 40 years. Do we know much about wildfires, going much further back in time? And I don't know if either of you would know, are wildfires a big thing in other parts of the world? Are there other countries that have big wildfires? I mean, I don't really read about it myself, but I imagine there must be other places that have big wildfires. Jonathan, do you know? Or
Oh yeah, well, of course, Australia, major bushfires, and that's where a lot of the epidemiology is coming from. Those birth cohorts,
yeah,
those are from Australia. Of course, Portugal, other parts of Europe. Yeah, plenty of places have big wildfires.
And are they increasing in their occurrence there as well, to your knowledge?
Well, the Australian fires are increasing in their intensity.
Okay.
I don't know about frequency, but they get bushfires every year. Paul, you might have the answer.
No, but I think it pretty much follows the same trends. So yeah.
Similarly in Africa, I think too. I think there's about a dozen wildfires going on in Africa currently, and so that's a pretty normal cycle in the central part of Africa as well. In terms of the question about going back 100 or 200 years, I'd say from an insurance data perspective, it starts to get pretty thin back then.
Yeah.
The other difference has been a tremendous change in population and a tremendous change in terms of not just the size of the population, but where the population resides. And so the relevance of that data starts to become less, simply because there just isn't data, because there weren't people living in those areas. And so what we found is, the more recent decades just tend to be more relevant in terms of comparison purposes.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, we are at the top of the hour, and I just want to thank all of you for joining us this evening on a Tuesday night. All right, well, thank you all very much again, and it's a very informative show. And again, our thoughts are with all those impacted by this in the LA area, and hopefully the situation will continue to be contained and we're past the most challenging parts of this real tragedy. So thank you to our audience for joining us. A lot of great questions tonight, and we'll be back next month with another episode. Thanks for joining us, and on Wisconsin.
At the University of Wisconsin-Madison, we believe in working together. That's why we're proud to partner with farmers and drive groundbreaking medical research and educate the next generation of teachers. One Wisconsin, on Wisconsin.